Hi, my name is Lucy, and welcome to Kids Talk Church History, a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Has he kept his promise? How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through history to find the answer here on Kids Talk Church History. Very few people outside of Italy will recognize the name Benedetto da Mantova. Actually, even in Italy, few people would recognize it. But he was a very important figure at the time of the Protestant Reformation. Stay tuned to find out what he did and why very few people today know anything about him and the Italian Reformation. My name is Lucy. I'm 17 and I'm from San Diego, California.
And my name is Christian. I'm 14 and I live in Charleston, South Carolina.
And I am Trinity. I live in Charleston, South Carolina, and I'm 16.
Benedetto. I remember that name.
That might be because Pastor Brown loved Benedetto's book, The Benefit of Christ. He talked about it all the time. Just so our listeners know, Trinity and Christian and I, we used to attend the same church in California, and Reverend Mike Brown was our pastor.
And he eventually became a missionary to Italy.
That's right. And Benedetto's book, The Benefit of Christ, was published in 1541 and became a bestseller in Italy. It sold 40,000 copies in 6 years in Venice alone. At that time, there weren't a lot of copies because printing presses were not as fast as they are today, and also because the price of books were so high.
I think it's also that not everyone knew how to read as well.
The book was especially loved by a small group of Italians who had been trying to promote a change in the Roman Catholic Church. This book included teachings that Luther and other Protestant reformers held to and that the Church had not yet officially condemned, doctrines like justification by faith alone. It was also translated into other languages.
But sadly, it was banned pretty fast.
Yes, and the authorities were very curious to know who had written it.
Wait, do you mean that it was published anonymously?
Yes, it was, and the authorities only found out about 20 years later when another Italian reformer, Pietro Carnesecchi, gave the author's name under a lot of torture. By then, the author, Benedetto, was already dead, so they couldn't do anything to him. But they still killed Carnesecchi.
But if it was such a bestseller, why does hardly anybody know about the book nowadays?
Probably because most of the copies were destroyed, and then Carnesecchi's confession was buried in the papal files until 1881, so no one even knew who the author was. There's really a lot more that we can say about this book and the Italian Reformation in general, but I think it's better if we leave the floor to our expert. You give a guess who?
Well, we know, but I think our listeners can guess by now too.
Yes, today we have here Reverend Michael Brown, our former pastor, who is now pastor of Chiesa Riformata Filadelfia in Milan, Italy. Welcome to our podcast, Pastor Brown.
Thanks, guys. I'm so happy to be with you. I miss you guys so much. And you guys, you already said everything, really. This is fantastic. I'm enjoying the commentary that you're giving on the short-lived Reformation in Italy.
Well, it's good to have you here. And you've heard our little discussion on Benedetto da Mantova. Did you have anything to add to it? Anything important we might have missed?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to the story. It's an interesting story that, it was a small book that was published. It was actually published in 1543. So it was 1 year after the Roman Inquisition, which was in 1542. And as you said, it was published anonymously because it was very dangerous around that time to put your name on a book like that talked about justification by faith alone. And it was a small book. It was only about 70 pages. And it was written in very simple, or what was simple Italian at the time. It wasn't written in Latin. It was written in a very accessible version of Italian for people, and it just took off like wildfire and spread all over the place. And as you said, it was translated into different languages, and it went all around Europe. And in fact, it was published in French, and English, and Spanish, Croatian, and lots of people praised it for being a very pastoral book, very warm. It explained very clearly the difference between the law and the gospel. There were even several cardinals in the Roman Catholic Church who appreciated the book because it was published before the Roman Catholic Church had an official position on the doctrine of justification by faith alone. And one other interesting detail is that it was King Edward VI's favorite book. It was his favorite piece of devotional literature. King Edward VI of England, he was a reformer, a young reformer, young like you guys, and he was the King of England at the time, but a very devout young man, and that was his favorite piece of devotional literature. So a very important book for the Reformation, not only in Italy, but even throughout Europe.
It sounds like it went everywhere, which is pretty cool. And I've heard actually that the book had a really long title. Do you think you could tell us what it is in Italian and tell us what it means?
Sure. So yeah, nowadays we just call it Il Beneficio or Il Beneficio di Cristo, but originally it had a long title. It was called Trattato Utissimo del Beneficio di Gesù Cristo Crocifisso verso I Cristiani, which translates to this is not a very catchy title, but a very useful treatise on the benefit of the crucified Jesus Christ for Christians. So in the 16th century, that was pretty common to have these long titles. And but as I said, most people just abbreviated it to be Il Beneficio.
Well, it gave an accurate description of what the book is. I mean, you put a very useful guide in the title, and people got to read it. So we also mentioned that in the book, there were some similar doctrines to what the reformers were talking about around that time. Do you have any examples of doctrines that lined up with them?
Well, yeah, the book is very small. It's only 6 chapters. And the first chapter is on original sin. The second one is on the law. And the third one is on the doctrine of justification. Fourth chapter is on how we receive the righteousness of Christ. The 5th chapter is on how we now live in thanksgiving and gratitude because of the righteousness of Christ that's been imputed to us. And then the 6th chapter is on how to be assured that we are the elect and that we've been justified by faith alone. And so all of those doctrines we find in a lot of the Protestant reformers. So Luther's doctrine of justification by faith alone, his distinction between the law, what God requires of us, and the gospel, what God has done for us in Jesus Christ, that same doctrine is very prominent in this little book. And then also with Calvin, how Calvin talked about how we are to live in gratitude and in response to the gospel. That's very clear in the book. And also Calvin's doctrine of the Lord's Supper, which is very interesting because one thing we want to keep in mind is that this person who wrote this book, Benedetto, he was a monk in the Roman Catholic Church. He was a Benedictine monk. In fact, all of the reformers during the 1530s and 1540s in Italy were in the Roman Catholic Church. And so they were trying to reform it from within. And as I said, they had no official position on justification by faith alone at that time. And they wanted to reform the church from within on these doctrines, but also on the doctrine of the Lord's Supper. And so we see Calvin's doctrine very clear that it's a means of grace, that when we partake of the bread and wine in faith, that we are truly communing with Christ in heaven, with his body and blood. That's very clear inside this book. And so, yeah, similar doctrines.
So you've mentioned a few times that the Roman Catholic Church didn't have an official stance on some of the positions when the book came out. When the book came out, did they change their stance on it? Or did they declare an official stance, or what did they do in face of these new things they hadn't addressed yet?
That's a great question. Yeah. So this is really interesting because a lot of times we don't realize that the Roman Catholic Church didn't have official positions on a lot of things that we as Protestants hold dear until the Council of Trent. And so during the Council of Trent, which was a long council, went from the 1540s into the 1560s, they met 25 times in the city of Trento. And during that council, they formulated official positions against the Reformation. One of them was the doctrine of justification. And they voted on that in January 1547. So this book came out in 1543. So that's 4 years before the Council of Trent met and decided on the doctrine of justification by faith alone. What's interesting is that that council, that was attended by all kinds of cardinals and Catholic theologians, that they talked a lot about this book, this little book, Il Beneficio, the benefit of Christ. That's how important it was in Italy at that time.
Now, it seems like there were a lot of people like Benedetto in Italy who wanted to, reform the church from within. Well, why did some fail while the Reformation took place in other countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. Why isn't the Reformation, why don't we see the fruit of the Reformation here in Italy as we see in other countries? In fact, when we think of the Protestant Reformation, we typically think of places like Switzerland. There's Geneva, where John Calvin was, or Zurich, which had an important school for the Protestants, or Strasbourg, on the border of France. Or we think of Germany, where Luther was, or England, where Thomas Cranmer was, or Holland, where the Synod of Dort met. But we don't think of Italy, And the reason for that, there's several reasons, but one important reason is that the Roman Inquisition that really started in 1542, it became so strong in Italy that by the time that the benefit of Christ was published, it was very dangerous to be a Protestant in Italy. And by the end of the 16th century, the Roman Catholic Church, in what its fight against Protestants, what they called the Counter-Reformation, they had crushed every attempt made by the Protestant movement to establish itself in Italy, as it had done elsewhere in Europe. And so, for example, Protestant books became illegal after the Inquisition in 1542. One by one, they would discover these books and they would put them on this list called the Index of Prohibited Books. And if you were caught with one, it could cost you your life. And they would burn these books in local squares, in the piazza. And so that's one of the reasons why it was very difficult. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is that, in the 16th century, it was very difficult for any of the Protestant reformers in any part of Europe to accomplish their goals of reforming the church without some cooperation of princes or city governments. It's just how things operated at that time. It wasn't like what we have in the United States, for example, where there's such a clear separation between church and state. You needed some cooperation with the government. And that was practically impossible in Italy. Italy wasn't a unified country back then. If you look at a map of Italy, you know how it's shaped like a boot. Kind of, it looks like a boot kicking a ball, which is, the ball down there is Sicily. And then there's another island called Sardinia. And then the whole boot, is the mainland of Italy. If you look at a map from the 16th century, it wasn't a unified country. Instead, it was a whole collection of these little kingdoms and republics. And so you had the Kingdom of Naples and the Republic of Venice and the Republic of Florence, Republic of Lucca, the Duchy of Milan, and so on. But the thing is, in all of those places, the church and state were so united against heresy, which they considered the Protestant movement to be, because they feared that it would have some kind of political or social or even economic consequences if they didn't just crush this thing and get rid of it. So that was a big reason. It was very, very difficult, almost impossible to work with any local governments. And then another reason why it failed is that really the best leaders of the Reformation in Italy after 1542, they either fled to Switzerland, people like Peter Martyr Vermigli or Girolamo Zanchi. They had to, go someplace where they were safe, which is one of the reasons why you have a lot of Italian names and Italian speakers even today in Switzerland. Or they were killed, or they tried to hide for a while and went underground, like Pietro Carnesecchi. And so it just didn't have the kind of traction that you see in the history of some other countries where there was development of the Protestant Reformation. So those are some of the reasons.
Yeah, you mentioned that many Italian reformers had to flee from Italy. Can you tell us a little bit about some of these people?
Sure. So, well, there was Peter Martyr Vermigli, and you know how Mrs. Carr wrote a wonderful book, and it's not just for children. I think it's great even for adults. A very simple biography on Peter Martyr Vermigli, who was he's probably the most remembered Protestant reformer. Probably the first Protestant reformer was actually a Spaniard called Juan de Valdez. And Peter Martyr Vermigli was his disciple, but Vermigli ended up teaching in the city of Lucca at a place called San Frediano. And he was very important. He eventually had to leave because it became too dangerous. And so by the time the Inquisition comes along, his life was on the line, and it was better for him to go across the Alps, not very far from where I'm at, and into Switzerland. And that way he was able to teach in another place. He ended up in England and worked on the Book of Common Prayer. And all of his works are wonderful, even to read today, most of which have been translated into English. Another person was Girolamo Zanchi. He was from, well, near a city called Bergamo, not far from me in Milan. And he had a friend named Celso Martinengo, who was from a city called Brescia. And these two guys, okay, Zanchi and Martinengo, they became teachers also at San Frediano in Lucca when Vermigli was there. When Vermigli left and he fled across the Alps and went into Switzerland and ended up teaching in other schools, they stayed. They stayed for almost 10 more years. And one of the Martinengo taught Greek and New Testament, and Zanchi taught theology and Old Testament. By 1551, it became too dangerous, and because they tried to keep their beliefs somewhat secret and just influence people, quietly. But it doesn't quite work that way, after some time. So they ended up leaving. Zanchi ended up becoming, after going all over the place, he became the professor of theology at Heidelberg, where we have the Heidelberg Catechism after Ursinus. And then his friend, Martinengo, he ended up becoming the pastor of the Italian immigrant church in Geneva. So both of those guys left, and both of those guys were used by the Lord outside of Italy. And so, yeah, those were a couple of guys. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Carnesecchi, he was a very, very important person in the short-lived Reformation. He was someone who didn't flee, and he fled around Italy when he was in trouble. He was a very, very brilliant person from a prominent family with very close ties to a very powerful family called the Medici. And he ended up, by age 25, he ended up becoming the secretary to Pope Clement VII. And Carnesecchi was so trusted by the Pope, and he was so influential that it was commonly reported in those days that the church was more controlled by Carnesecchi than by the Pope. That's how important this guy was. The interesting thing was, though, he became an acquaintance of Juan de Valdez and Vermigli and all of these other reformers inside Italy, and Giulia Gonzaga, who's a wonderful woman who did so much for the Reformation, and Mrs. Carr also wrote a great book on her. Well, this Carnesecchi, eventually his life was on the line and he had to leave as well, but he didn't flee Italy. Instead, he went to Venice for a while, which was considered a little bit safer to be, and stayed there for quite a long time, for many years. Once the Pope died, a Pope named Pope Paul IV, who was very violent against the Protestants, it seemed like maybe it would be a little bit easier for him to move around, and he came back to live in Rome. And then when another Pope, Pope Pius V, became Pope, in 1566, it became a little bit too dangerous for him, and they looked for him and found him. He fled to Florence and stayed with the Medici family, but one of the Medici, a guy named Duke Cosimo I, he secretly turned him in, basically betrayed Carnesecchi to the Pope, hoping to get some favor in return. And so in July of 1566, he went to prison. And on October 1st, Carnesecchi was publicly beheaded and then burned right on that famous bridge in Rome, outside of a huge castle. And so, very sad story, but a very important person.
Yeah, continuing on that strain, a lot of Italians who like the teachings of the Reformation also ended up being tortured by the Roman Catholic Church. Can you explain a little bit more on why the Catholic Church was so violent against the Reformers?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, Trinity, to be honest with you, because you could approach it from a few different angles, I think. One important thing to remember is that in the 16th century, the Roman Catholic Church, because it's tied to local governments, it's tied to princes and city governments, and the Pope has so much political power that heresy was punishable by death. It was a serious crime, and depending on what the heresy was, they could kill you. And so it's hard for us to think about that today because, thankfully, the government doesn't kill people for heresy. But that's how it was in the 16th century. And they believed the Protestant movement, the Reform movement, was heresy. And they felt they were justified in doing so. And I think we have to also remember that there is definitely a spiritual aspect behind this, that Satan hates the gospel, and Satan will use anything, even an established church, if he can get inside and get his way, to fight against the gospel, to fight against the good news that we are justified by Christ alone, faith in him alone, all by God's grace alone. He wants to destroy that message. And at that time, he used the Roman Catholic Church to try to stomp out that message, and for that to finally become illegal to hold that position. And so I think it's difficult for us nowadays in the 21st century to see how it would be violent, how a church would use violence against other people, and it certainly is not right. But if we look at how they judged things, how the church was so united to the state in the Middle Ages and going into the 16th century, it helps us see a little bit of how they could do such a thing.
Why do you think few people today know about the Italian Reformation?
Well, Christian, honestly, I think that, the Italian, as I said before, we don't think of Italy, first of all, when we think of the Reformation. Italy is the home of the Pope and the Roman Inquisition and the Vatican, the Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent. Even though Italy was the birthplace of the Renaissance, which had so much to do with the Reformation, because of the Renaissance, people started reading Greek again and going back and trying to read the Bible in its original languages, and going back and reading the early fathers and their original languages. That gave birth to the Reformation. But sadly, Italy became a graveyard for the Reformation because of the power of the Roman Catholic Church. So for one, there isn't a whole lot. There's not a lot of books out there, like there are, all of Calvin's commentaries, or, we think of Luther and all the works that he had. We think of, all the Puritans in the 17th century. There's a lot of material. When we think of Italian reformers, there's not as much material. In fact, the greatest reformers like Vermigli and Zanchi, did most of their work outside of Italy. While they were in Italy, they were trying to reform from within. And so there's not as much for us to look at today as we could, looking at reformers that were in other countries. I think that's a big part of it. And then another part is, there is a lot to learn, actually. There's a ton to learn. And there are some scholars, Italians, who have studied the Reformation for many, many, many years and have written some wonderful, wonderful books on the development of the Reformation during the 1520s, the first 1530s, 1540s, and then everything that happened throughout the 16th century, that some of them aren't translated into English, and we don't have access to them, as English readers. I've read them in Italian, and they're wonderful. I've learned so much about so many people that I had no idea about. So there was a reform movement here. It just didn't last as long. And I think that's really the short answer. It just didn't last very long.
I was also wondering, at the time of the Reformation, was there an Italian Bible that people could read?
Good question. Yeah. So, well, you guys are history scholars on this show, and you know that the printing press, was in the 15th century. I think it was in 1455 in Gutenberg. And so people were printing things, and there was lots of translations of the Bible in different languages. And there was a translation, probably the first translation was as early as 1471, if I remember correctly. And it was translated from the Latin into Italian, not from Hebrew and Greek, because you remember the Old Testament was originally in Hebrew and the New Testament was originally in Greek. And so there was that, but not many people had access to it. Then in the 16th century, in 1530, there was a Bible translation by a guy named Antonio Brucioli. And Brucioli was sympathetic to the Reformation. He believed the doctrine of justification by faith alone, and he translated some of it from Hebrew and Greek, but some of it also from Latin. He wasn't as skilled as others who came along later. Now, that Bible, there were people that used that Bible, but it was not super accessible, by average normal people. More of, scholarly people or people who could read had access to it, but it was used. In fact, it was so well known that in 1559, that it was added to that index that I told you about, the index of prohibited books, and so it became illegal. The best Italian translation in the time of the Reformation came in 1607, so just a little later, and that was by a guy named Giovanni Diodati, and he was the professor of Hebrew at the University of Geneva. He was actually born in Switzerland because his family had fled Italy during the Inquisition, and his translation, which is still used to this day, it's just a more modern version today, but his was really the first that was directly from the original Greek and the original Hebrew texts. So, short answer was yes, there was a Bible. Not a lot of people had access to it. A little later, by 1607, there was an Italian Bible that was used more widely, and it's still in use to this day.
Thank you for answering all of our questions, but it's getting late. So we have 2 questions we ask all of our guests. First, in a few words, how did you become interested in church history and in the Italian Reformation in particular?
Well, church history, I just have always found so interesting that, it doesn't go from the apostles and the book of Acts, and we just skip right over to us today. Instead, there's a whole story. And when you start to study church history like you guys do, you learn so much. You learn about people who were Christians just like us in different places and in different times. You learn how doctrines were developed. It's encouraging. It's also sad at times, depending on what the stories are. but I just find church history to be fascinating. The Italian Reformation in particular, I find incredibly interesting because it was very short-lived. As you mentioned earlier, Christian, or asked, not many people know about it. And that's something I think that we need to learn more about. And hopefully there'll be more material. Hopefully Mrs. Carr and other people will write more so that people can learn about the Italian Reformation.
And second question, if you could meet anyone from the time of the Reformation, who would that be?
That's a tough one. I don't know. That would be a hard one. I mean, I think Martin Luther would be the most fun to hang out with. I think John Calvin would be very interesting. But I only speak English and Italian, so I'd probably have to go with Peter Martyr Vermigli so we could at least talk, or maybe Gerolamo Zanchi, and it would be nice. Maybe we could enjoy some risotto together, and or maybe a cornetto.
Well, Reverend Brown, grazie mille. We are very thankful that you decided to spend this time with us. And we thank you for answering all of our questions about the Italian Reformation. And for our listeners, if you visit our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org, you'll find a link where you can enter a drawing for a free book. This time, we're giving away one of Simonetta Carr's books, one that Pastor Brown mentioned today, about Peter Martyr Vermigli that covers a lot of the Italian Reformation. And while you're on our website, you can check out past episodes, special news, recommended readings, and more. Now, in partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and on behalf of my co-hosts, Christian and Trinity, my name is Lucy. Thank you for listening to Kids Talk Church History. And as the Italians say, arrivederci.